Temos uma sessão.
Good afternoon. I hope you are well. This is going to be an interesting and important afternoon. We have a number of speakers representing different organizations. The sound vanished. There's no sound now. I cannot get the sound. It's back. We've been meeting since last year to talk about the opportunities and exploring opportunities within a framework where we've been talking about the voluntary principles on businesses, security, and the human rights as an important platform in order to discuss the situation in Cabo Delgado. Throughout the latest 3 months, we had a series of activities that have allowed us to be closer to the challenges behind the situation in Cabo Delgado. At the same time, to be closer so that together we could select an approach that seems to be the most appropriate for the situation in Cabo Delgado. We have this session, and first of all, we are going to have intervention. Colonel Omar Angra, on behalf of Ministry of Defense, is going to present the opening speech. After that, we are going to have the Ambassador Royland, who is retired now. We are going to have then the intervention of Lisa, apologies, from the Institute for Security Studies in South Africa. This will be followed by the intervention of Piers and then Stefan from the GGA. And then Khalid Kazer from the GSERF, the CDD team composed of Richard Rance and by Anthony Bonut, who are here with us.
Não vou me prolongar.
I'm not going to say much. The key issue, the key reason for being here is so that we could explore the two deal for dialogue, the issues that are in place in Cabo Delgado. Without any further ado, I would like to give the floor to Colonel Omar Angra to address the audience. You have the floor. Mr. Adriano Vunga, Executive Director of the Center for Democracy and Development. Dear members of the panel, dear entities that are following the webinar, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to start by presenting our gratitude to the Democracy and Development Center, especially to the Executive Director, Mr. Adriano Nuvunga, for the invitation addressed to the Minister of National Defense to participate at this dialogue platform. And we would like to thank him for having asked me to represent him, the minister, and to be part of the discussion of an issue which interests the Mozambican considerably, which is conflict resolution in Cabo Delgado, exploring opportunities, strategic considerations, recommendations to policymakers, dialogue, and methodology. Allow me also to greet the distinct colleagues who are participating in this dialogue platform. Excellencies, the MDM, when participating in this discussion, speaks from the perspective that we are continuing to value the initiative of the CDD after a very successful program of webinars related to the voluntary principles on security and human rights, to which the ministry has participated with a great honor and pleasure. The Ministry of National Defense as the entity responsible for preventing conflicts and assisting the population in cases of disasters and other circumstances by decision of the competent authority. It's an essential part in the defense of human rights. National defense, in addition to being an obligation of the state and of the citizens within the scope of participatory citizenship with the purpose of preserving peace, it's important to highlight that we have the obligation of preserving also life as a public policy, without which the country's development would have been committed because of the impact that it has. Unquestionable, the well-being of the Mozambican population. Universal Declaration of the Rights of Man and Human states that all men and women have the right for social security, and by means of the international cooperation according to the resources and organization of each state, and they have the right for economic, social, and all those rights that are important for their dignity and for the human person. Excellencies, the armed and defense forces are prepared to respond to the events of terrorism, armed bandits in the center of the country. They are highly responsible for being part of the solution of the conflict perpetrated by terrorists without any ethics, who have perpetrated attacks since October 2017, killing people and destroying social and economic infrastructures, affecting children, women, and men, and creating huge numbers of internal displaced in the other provinces in a clear, aberrant violation of human rights. Excellent. Exploring opportunities, targeting to conflict solution. There are people who argue that there are two ways of solving this problem: employing violence in order to respond violence, or resorting to peaceful means in order to respond violence. Violence in all its dimensions, it's nothing that's desirable, because it violates the basic principles of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. It's banning resorting to violence affects the rights of people, and a conflict of interest and dispute for power can be solved through a variety of other means. However, in the modus operandi of those that kill, decapitate, and massacre the populations, and whom at the same time steal agricultural products that belong to the households, and the resolution, conflict resolution becomes then complex because the conflict, the process of resolution requires a number of ethical principles that involved in a in a rule of law, where the principles and indicators of implementation have to do with the constructive debate of ideas. And we have to try at all costs to try to find the well-being of the whole society, because we do not have any interlocutor. The FDS or the defense and security forces have to exercise their constitutional right of protecting the national territory and the national assets in order to ensure the normal operation of the Mozambican institutions. This results from the understanding that the resolution of the armed conflict in Cabo Delgado requires the involvement of a multiplicity of stakeholders and appropriate methodologies and techniques that are universally accepted within the scope of the resolution of this type of conflicts. The exercise aimed at restoring the normality and the construction of a nationalistic ideal in relation to the national extremism in Cabo Delgado requires persuasive measures followed by the preventive and protective actions involving the resorting to coercive power, involving then the FDS, the Armed Security and Defense Forces. The use of force through the FDS are justified for the need, by the need to eliminate the terrorist attacks and creating normality. The resolution of the conflict in Cabo Delgado by peaceful means would be the desirable option. The forces of defense and security, they opt for dialogue, and they opt for civilian and military actions, collaborating with the community associations and civil society organizations with the purpose of establishing, keeping, and influencing the relationships between the military and the governmental and non-governmental entities and civilians in a relationship based on friendship, transparency, and consolidating and conquering the objectives, operational objectives of the Mozambican state. As you can notice, the negotiable dialogue presupposes the existence of at least two interested parts. Excellencies, dear participants, the Ministry of National Defense, through the Civic and Patriotic Education Program given to the armies, try to inculcate or educate the armed forces so that they can build trust with the communities, and to instill in them a message of humanism and discourage the association with terrorist groups. Before concluding, I would like now and at this moment to greet and recognizing the commitment of the youths in the armed forces, particularly those who are in the operational areas in the northern and central regions of the day and night to do everything at their core in order to preserve peace that is being affected by terrorist attacks. Finally, I would like to encourage the participants of this platform to suggest dialogue perspectives, constructive dialogue, and functional perspectives, so that in the short run, they can contribute to the resolution of the armed conflict in Cabo Delgado. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Colonel Omar Saranga. We take note of what you say. We fully agree.
no diálogo,
We need to have parts that are interested in the dialogue. We register the recommendation that you leave so that these panel can discuss
para
constructive
o
ways
que
for
se
dialogue,
mostra urgente
for the
para
dialogue that appears to be urgent, so that we can find solutions
esperança do nosso
in the
povo,
hope
esperança
that
do
we
nosso
can improve the conditions for our populations and the country, so that we can build a society where men and women can live out of misery. So as such, this joint effort aimed at finding solutions for Cabo Delgado in a dialogue that intends to be inclusive and constructive. Today, in this discussion, we have these panelists. We have simultaneous interpreting. You feel free to speak in the language that you are most comfortable with. Most of our facilitators will be speaking in English. However, we have Portuguese interpreting so that you are able to follow and do an inclusive dialogue without any further delays. I'm going to give the floor to the ambassador, Roland van der Geer, for the initial considerations. You have the floor. Thank you very much, Director. I would like to thank you for this opportunity to exchange ideas and the approaches concerning the situation in Cabo Delgado, which is an important part of our glorious land. I would like to highlight the importance of the intervention and the words of the Colonel Saranga. Thank you very much. To facilitate the discussion, I would like to speak in English. With your permission.
And my apologies to the translators into English. In the first place, I would like to greet my fellow members of the panel, some of whom I haven't seen for a number of years, but I'm very happy to react with them. I would like to build on the intervention of the Colonel and then build a bridge to the following interventions. I think we've all seen that there are different interpretations of the conflict. And as I served in Mozambique, but also in South Africa and in Tanzania, I've been in touch, of course, with experts and friends and people in these different countries. And out of that comes, in the first place, that we need to better understand, that is very clear to everybody, the nature of the conflict and the nature of the violence. And I think that NGOs will be able to play an important role there in strengthening the research and reaching out to people and opening the participation of the inhabitants of Cabo Delgado in the, let us say, diagnostics of the situation. So I think the first step in front of everything should be this investigation, this independent investigation in which there will be place for think tanks and for NGOs. In the first place, of course, Mozambican NGOs, but if possible, and if there are links, certainly also NGOs from the region. I'm thinking in terms of Tanzania, of course, and South Africa. That is extremely important. Now, once this diagnostic is more clear, obviously there should be room for mediation, prevention, solution. Mediation, of course, geared towards prevention of the further escalation of the conflict, but certainly also in the direction of resolution. As we've seen in many conflicts, not only in Africa, but also, for instance, on the Philippines, where there have been attacks also on communities and attacks on oil companies and others. It is a matter of finding the right balance, a solid military approach and mediation, prevention and resolution. When I served in Afghanistan, it was very clear that a military approach would in the end not resolve the problem. And I'm inclined to think that this is the case for many of the type of conflicts that we see in these times, which in many ways are intra-nation, intra-country conflicts rather than inter-country conflicts. And I don't think I cannot underline at this point enough mediation in finding resolution of finding an integral approach in which people feel represented, an inclusive approach. In the third place, I'm sure that it will be extremely important to monitor the process in Cabo Delgado over the coming period. Monitoring by a broad-based, again, inclusive panel in which also the people of Cabo Delgado feel themselves represented. If you allow me to quickly make a step into Europe, also here in Europe, we feel that societal tensions are to a large extent caused by a non-inclusive approach, a non-participatory approach. And I think this is one of the main concrete things we can do. The dialogue with a broad-based and inclusive panel. And then, of course, there is the issue of the exploitation of natural resources. When I served in South Africa, also when I lived in the 70s in Lesotho, I had the opportunity several times to visit the hole of Kimberley, which is a very big hole and which is completely empty today, but it served to flood mankind with diamonds and gold. Yet the environment in Kimberley, even today, is still a very, very poor environment. And I think it is essential that there will be ways, means, tools
Your microphone is off. O microfone está desligado. Your micro is off. Your microphone is off. O microfone está desligado.
I'm all the time muted, but no, I'm rounding off anyway. But to find mechanisms. Sorry, Anton. Yes. Yeah, to find mechanisms to share the natural resources. I think that is important. That would be basically the 4 points I would like to throw on the table to start. Senhor Presidente da Mesa, muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. Deixem parar aqui.
Roeland Van de Guia, muito obrigado.
And Dr. Ron
o que
van
disse
de Guia,
foi
Ambassador,
que
thank you very
temos que
much.
encontrar
What you
formas
said
de
is
partilhar os
that we need to
recursos.
find ways of sharing
O embaixador
resources.
fez
The
referência ao trabalho
ambassador
que fez quando
referred
esteve em
to the
África
work
e
he
a visita que
conducted
fez ao Kimberley.
in Africa and
O
his
Kimberley
visit to
é processo de
Kimberley.
produção de
Kimberley
diamantes.
is a process of production of diamonds. Diamonds that you dig and then go and sell, and then you have profit. But when your resource is natural gas, you for more than 10 years doing the exploration. We take note of what you said, Ambassador. I would now like to invite Piers, my good friend, Piers from the International Crisis Group. Piers, you have the floor.
I'm happy to have you. Thank you very much, comrade.
Thank you, Adriano. Thank you very much. And thank you very much to the Center for Democracy and Development. Greetings to everyone from Johannesburg, where I am based. And I'm delighted to be part of this panel and to see old friends and some new ones. Very nice to see Ambassador Roland van der Geer after a long time. And hear his wise words, because I think, there were two key words that came out of his input just now, which were balance and inclusivity stroke ownership. And I think, what we know about this this very important topic is that those two issues relating to dealing with security and a situation where, as we see in Cabo Delgado, in terms of building options for sustainable solutions, that whilst there are certainly immediate priorities relating to security and the humanitarian situation, what we know is that those issues will only be resolved in a sustainable way if they can address the underlying problems and causes that have contributed to what is a rapidly deteriorating situation over the last 3 years, and particularly in the last 15 months. The International Crisis Group is an international conflict prevention organization based out of Brussels, but operating across the country, across the world, focused on field-based research, looking at options to present policy recommendations to key stakeholders trying to grapple with complex and difficult situations, including ones such as we see in Cabo Delgado. Crisis Group has been conducting field work in Mozambique in the last few months, and we're in the process of drafting a report which will include some recommendations that we hope will constructively contribute to Mozambique finding its way through this exceptionally difficult and challenging terrain. I don't want to go into the details of the findings of the report, save to say that our understanding of the conflict is informed obviously by our fieldwork, but by the work that has come before us. And our findings echo some of what has already come before in terms of emphasizing what people call the local drivers of conflict. There are many, many factors involved, and as Ambassador van der Geer pointed out, there are differences of opinion. So as to the root causes, the weight that should be given to those causes, the interrelationship between all those factors, and so on. And so I would certainly echo the ambassador's call for dealing with these issues in a way that penetrates the research field even further. And it's encouraging to see Mozambican research institutes, as well as regional and international efforts, increasing at this time. And we look forward to engaging with the government and other interested stakeholders on the findings of this research to work towards a common objective in terms of conflict prevention. Now, we've already heard from President Nyusi over the last months and year or so, holding out a hand for the notion of dialogue and amnesty. And as Colonel Saranga quite importantly points out, who do you get in a situation where violations are perpetrated by an effective leaderless group of individuals that are perpetrating this insurgency? So we need to look at all sorts of ways on how we can scaffold interventions, not only with respect to how to deal with an insurgency and insurgents, but also in terms of the conditions, the communities from which insurgents have been able to recruit and so forth. And this means that the strategy and tactics that are developed and implemented must not only take account of the hard security priorities and the hard humanitarian conditions that are in place, but it must do so with the objective of building social capital and, to echo the ambassador again, processes of inclusive governance and economic activity. Now, these challenges are not unique to Mozambique. Specific conditions in Cabo Delgado certainly may be, but there are lessons to be learned from other parts of the continent and from the globe. And I think these can be important resources for Mozambique in terms of guiding the development of its own journey. And the International Crisis Group is committed to participating and offering its assistance in that regard towards those objectives. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado, Piers, por estas palavras.
Thank you very much, Piers, for these words and for presenting your perspective of the problem and how we can holistically look at this problem and which solutions we can find for the situation in Cabo Delgado. As you correctly say, we need to have an intervention that may generate a stable solution, because at the moment, clearly, it's a situation of fragility that we witness. I'm going to enter the next speaker, but beforehand, I would like to say that the speakers will be speaking in English.
And we have a Portuguese translation. You can choose which you want to listen to, whether to the original English. In order to do that, you can just off the Portuguese translation. You just off. You have the button in your Zoom where you have interpretation, from which you can choose English, Portuguese, or you can simply off the translation. In so doing, you will hear directly the speaker. We have done that because we are also broadcasting via Zoom, via Facebook. So it allows the wider public in the Facebook also to follow directly from the Portuguese interpretation, because that is meant for the wider Mozambican public. Apologies for that, but you can opt to switch off the Portuguese translation. Thank you very much for understanding. Passamos agora para
we are now going to give the floor to Lisa Vandra from the Institute for Security Studies of South Africa. Lisa, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Professor. I hope you can all hear me. Thank you for inviting us as the Institute for Security Studies. Maybe just a short introduction. The ISS is a think tank that works on human security across the continent. We are headquartered in Pretoria, but we have a big office with the African Union in Addis Ababa and in Dakar and Nairobi. And for the last 30 years, we have been working on various aspects of security, also multilateral responses through the African Union, SADC, ECOWAS, and others. But we have been very involved, particularly in the Horn of Africa and in West Africa, with dealing with the issues of violent extremism. And our many reports have come out, and our approach, I think, when the crisis in Cabo Delgado started, was to say we can learn lessons from what has happened elsewhere on the continent, so that we don't repeat the same mistakes. And as is the case very much in the Lake Chad Basin and in the Sahel, sometimes it has taken many years to come to solutions of looking at root causes, not only looking at military responses, and looking at alternative strategies such as dialogue and so on. So that is the ISS. I have been with the ISS for a very long time, working also with the African Union and Southern Africa. So I just want to also echo what Piers and Ambassador van der Geen. Our main concern is that responses to this crisis and any crisis should be evidence-led, so that we can have analysis based on exactly what the research shows, because they are conflicting narratives, access and transparency really with everyone, in order, as I say, not to repeat the same mistakes we've made elsewhere. There is, as you all know, a huge concern globally, increasingly, about the crisis in Cabo Delgado. And of course, it's true that because of the huge financial investment, the presence of big multinational companies heightens the interest and ups the stakes. And we have been very concerned right from the start that we would see a multiplication of different answers. So actually in August last year, the IS2B, of course, there is no question that Mozambique is leading a response, but we are glad to be the SADC organ. There were 3, and then the double troika very recently. So we feel we would, as part of non-military responses, dialogue, people of Union Security Council. SADC's role, apart from, and forgive me, I don't want to repeat what everybody else said, which we fully agree with, so I'll just talk about what we think SADC can contribute as a SADC member state. And there have been these various meetings, and next week a very important meeting of the Organ on Politics, Defense and Security Cooperation again, to look at this. SADC can, as I say, show its concern. Initially last year, when we raised the alarm, as I say, we talked about fact-finding missions, which is, we've now seen that technical deployment, highlighting the issues of the humanitarian crisis. Even though, as I say, we understand the difficulties of multilateral intervention as SADC. But SADC can assist Mozambique in various ways, also to alert and reassure investors, because I think for countries like Africa and the neighbors, and Mozambique especially, the kind of conflict, if it continues, is a blow to the confidence in the region and as I say, the concern by the international community is SADC at the root causes, and SADC has got vast experience of the last 2 decades at least of promoting dialogue, promoting mediation as responses to crisis. So I think SADC is the first port of call. The African Union as well is willing to assist and concerned. So we are, I would say, would like to see more cooperation in the region, and I think the region would like to cooperate to have multilateral responses before we look outside of our region. And we look forward to the meeting next week. And us as the ISS, we stand ready. As I said, we have many reports, many investigations on the issues of violent extremism, of conflict around the continent that we have shared and that we are willing to share. So, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak.
Liesl, muito obrigado a destacar a importância de uma compreensão profunda daquilo que são as causas do conflito. A necessidade de se aprender e se buscar lições de situações próximas àquelas que se passam em Cabo Delgado. E a necessidade também de envolver a SADC e estranhar a forma como a SADC esteve silenciosa desde 2017 para somente nesta parte dar alguma visibilidade. É importante que já está aqui a SADC neste momento e o papel que a SADC pode desempenhar, não somente diretamente aqui em Moçambique, mas também na ligação com outros atores, como a União Africana e outros atores importantes, que são claramente importantes, mas sobretudo para passar esta mensagem de que a solução para o problema de Cabo Delgado passa importantemente pelo diálogo. Passa importantemente pelo diálogo. Mas eu sou facilitador, vou passar apenas a palavra agora ao meu amigo Stephen Puchan, from the Good Governance Africa Institute. Stephen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Nwonga. And apologies to the audience who expected my executive director, Chris Marling, from Good Governance Africa, presenting today. He had to some urgent travel, so I have taken his place. I'll try to do it justice. But as Prof. Nwonga mentioned, my name is Stephen Buchanan Clark, and I serve as head of the Human Security and Climate Change Program at Good Governance Africa. We're an African NPO with offices in Johannesburg, Ethiopia, Abuja, and Ghana, and we seek to improve governance performance across the continent and really build more inclusive political settlements through targeted research, advocacy, multi-stakeholder engagement. Because our position at Good Governance Africa is that countering violent extremism is most effectively done upstream by ensuring good governance and inclusive political settlements. Before I begin, I do just want to thank CTD for this opportunity to participate on this I think really important platform, and congratulate them on the continued work they've done and the rest of the team. At GGA, over the last 3 years, we've commissioned an anthology series on extremisms in Africa, which comprises of 3 volumes with contributions from a variety of scholars and practitioners from Africa and abroad. Our idea was to better understand major trends in violent extremism and terrorism on the continent and create actionable policy insights to prevent and counter violent extremism. As some of my colleagues, Liesl just mentioned, there are lessons to be learned from other contexts on the continent, and it's important that we do so. While of course every context is different, I think there are some best practices that we really should consider in regard to the insurgency in Cabo Delgado. So I think for my presentation today, and I don't want to repeat what's already been said, because I am very much in agreement, I think, with his and Liesel's position. But maybe I'll just present 3 or 4 key takeaways from that series of books on violent extremism. And firstly, as both my colleagues mentioned, purely kinetic responses are ineffective and oftentimes counterproductive. And it's not really just that. What we found is not that it's the potential for collateral damage and security sector abuses to fuel grievances, but when you get that spiraling of violence and insecurity, it tends to decouple formal and informal authority structures and disrupt patterns of relative peaceful coexistence between communities. This decline in community resilience and increase in intergroup conflict is really when violent extremist actors can leverage themselves and gain a greater foothold. I think globally, in terms of developmental approaches to preventing and countering violent extremism, two of the main challenges, I should say, is one is the timescales involved. Developmental approaches often take much longer to see results. Oftentimes those results are also difficult to measure, whereas many campaigns can produce immediate results and can be easily measured. However, they're not sustainable in the long term. So while military responses are of course necessary to secure the security of local populations, I think they should be used in a limited way and as targeted as possible. And of course, part of a strategic sequence on which longer term developmental approaches can be established, which address social, economic, and political grievances, which can give fuel to violent extremism. And of course, all the military campaign should really be anchored in human rights and respect for international law. Second, I think a key takeaway from this series of anthologies, and this is one that Liesel alluded to, is that, and we've seen in relation to Cabo Delgado, there's often these competing narratives around the degree to which the roots and drivers of the insurgency are local or more transnational in nature. I think, and as is the case in Cabo Delgado, the truth is that it's usually a degree of local and transnational dimensions to any violent extremist conflict. Also, one of the major trends we've seen, conflict trends we've seen across the continent, is an increasing transnationalization of conflict systems. That we need to lost the potential regional dimensions of the conflict in Cabo Delgado, where, of course, organizations like governments to work together in measures such as increased reparations, implementing mutual assistance laws, etc. And then past what are some of the local drivers of violent extremism, which will require, of course, government, civil society really working together in a constructive manner to reduce the social and political grievances which fuel violent extremism. And then thirdly, I think often when we discuss responses to violent extremism, they often tend to be at the geopolitical and national levels, where sustainable is almost always found really at the local level. Violent extremism thrives in contexts where trust is broken down between perhaps local government and communities. Ideological landscape is in flux. There's perceptions of marginalization, lack of service delivery, etc. However, I think it's really important that we emphasize the need for nuanced and focused research right at this hyper-local level to understand the communities most affected by conflict, particularly vulnerable populations, women and girls, the local history of the area, custom norms, the local political economy, to get a better sense of what specific drivers are used within recruitment and radicalization operations, and how to, most importantly, develop effective interventions that can utilize local capacity to address these local level drivers of extremism. Also, I think in what we've seen in the Sahel and Somalia and elsewhere, in contexts where there's a high degree of hybrid governance between informal traditional structures and local formal governments and traditional leaders and perhaps church leaders have an outsized role in relation to governance. They should really be seen as crucial in their efforts to sustainable approaches to countering violent extremism in the long term. Unfortunately, what we've seen many times in the continent, but elsewhere, generally around the global war on terrorism, is increasing securitization, a process where society space is closed, the reduction in community-based organizations being able to operate. I think this really reduces the capacity of local communities to engage in self-protection initiatives, early warning, and problem solving. So I really think it's important to get local communities on board as soon as possible. And then finally, and I think as I mentioned at the top of my presentation, is that, and it's not really just because I work for Good Governance Africa, but you know, I think 20 years of counterterrorism operations have taught us that governance really is should be mainstream within operations to prevent violent extremism over the long term. This has been recognized in the Global Fragility Act in the US. The United Nations Security Council have all emphasized the need for good governance as a cross-cutting theme in whole society approaches to countering violent extremism. And I think that's something we should consider, particularly in regard to Cabo Delgado. And maybe as a way of ending off, you know, what we've seen in other contexts is what I think Liesl alluded to as an influx of actors, whether it's multilaterals, INGOs, and this can oftentimes create confusion and actually serve to erode the legitimacy of the state, which we're really trying to rebuild. So I think it's important to work in a collaborative and a coordinated approach, or else there really is a risk to add additional complexity to the conflict environment. I think I'll leave it there at risk of repeating what my colleague says. And perhaps we can pick up some additional points in the discussion. Thank you.
Obrigado, Stefan, por essas considerações. Eu tive aqui o ponto onde diz que a questão de segurança, mas fundamental e os desenvolvimentos considerarem isso, mas muito em particular se preparar para ações movidas pelo terrorismo e por insurgências e extremismo violento. O que está-nos a dizer o Stefan é que quando nós iniciamos o desenvolvimento em Moçambique, para quem se recorda da forma como tudo começou, descobrimos os recursos naturais, o gás, ficamos todos muito felizes porque temos world class gas reserves, fomos discutindo as melhorias do setor, mas negligenciamos os aspectos que nos conduziram hoje ao ponto onde nós estamos. E o ponto do Stefan é justamente esse. Temos que ter em conta aqueles aspectos que quer estudos mostram, quer estudos comparados nos conduzem à necessidade de termos isso em conta. Neste painel sobre Conflict Analysis and Recommendations for Policymakers, tivemos a intervenção do Pierce, a intervenção da Liesl e agora a intervenção do Stefan. Antes de fecharmos, queria que me permitisse, eu convidei aqui Carlton Cadeado. Carlton Cadeado é professor do Instituto Superior de Relações Internacionais aqui em Maputo. ele colocou uma pergunta no chat box. Eu convidei para que ele pudesse colocar a questão. Dr. Carlton Cadeado.
Professor, muito obrigado por me convidar para fazer parte desta importante palestra, deste importante fórum de discussão. A minha pergunta é se é possível discutir com o terrorismo sem face. Eu estou preocupado com isto porque tenho a impressão de que quem está por detrás deste terrorismo intencionalmente decidiu esconder a face deste grupo porque não quer conversar. Ou então está à espera do momento certo, o right moment, to decide to negotiate in a strong and a powerful position. Então, isto é para mim importante. Não é possível negociar com um terrorismo sem face. E muito obrigado.
Você quiser apanhar ele? Muito obrigado, Dr. Carlton Cadeado. Penso que o ponto ficou claro para os painelistas. E o Dr. Carlton Cadeado é policy maker neste país, pelo instituto que ele representa. E achei que era importante o trazer aqui. E trago também aqui, muito rapidamente, 2 minutos, professor Yusuf Adam, um dos muito poucos que conhece este assunto como ninguém. Professor.
Muito obrigado. Em primeiro lugar, queria de facto salientar a importância da declaração que foi feita pelo coronel Saranga de que se pode resolver o conflito também sem armas, também se pode, digamos, que não, o conflito em Cabo Delgado não é um conflito que poderemos resolver só pela via militar, e eu acho que é extremamente importante porque marca, de certa maneira, um corte nas afirmações de estratégia política do nosso governo. A segunda questão que eu queria pôr, não vale a pena estarmos a falar constantemente em homens sem rosto, porque não há homens nem mulheres sem rosto, e muito menos homens e mulheres sem rosto fazem a guerrilha. E esta guerrilha é uma guerrilha complexa, e nós sabemos mais ou menos qual é a composição dessa guerrilha e, basicamente, eles têm dito o que querem. E que também, às vezes, o que eles querem é aquilo que muitos de nós queremos. Eles não querem a corrupção, eles não querem a distribuição justa dos bens, etc. Há uma diferença, e essa diferença foi apontada pelo coronel Saranga, de que nós queremos umas mudanças dentro de um quadro do Estado democrático, não é? O que eu queria dizer é que é fundamental que estes assuntos que nós estamos a discutir sejam discutidos, porque elas já discutem. Eu falei com alguns régulos, com alguns imãs, líderes religiosos, etc., e alguns deles foram, inclusivamente, ter com o Presidente da República, com o Sr. Filipe Nyusi, e disseram-lhe para com a guerra. E então a guerra pode ser parada rapidamente. E temos que evitar esta doença de fazer cada vez mais investigação. Outro dia estava a falar com o Pierre Spigou, porque ele estava a ver dados, informação, e de repente tanta coisa aqui já feita que ninguém lê. E eu acho que também temos que ter cuidado com isso. É necessário utilizar a informação que já existe. E não esqueçamos que, quando estamos a falar de Cabo Delgado, estamos a falar de cerca de 8 a 9 distritos que estão, não diria, o total de cabos, porque o nosso exército, quando quiser, entra lá. A população sente-se controlada pelos insurgentes. Então, para isso é preciso também consultar a população ela quer e trabalharem. Okay. Com as grandes empresas, nós propusemos que elas mudassem, eu, o Greco Pírio e mais um colega, temos 3 artigos, um deles, o último, é a proposta às grandes empresas para que tenham paradigmas de desenvolvimento que sejam aceitáveis pelas comunidades e que sejam user-friendly, que aceitem bem a relação com a natureza, etc. E até agora o que nós verificamos que todas essas empresas de petróleo nada disso fizeram, mesmo que falem sobre isso. Muito obrigado e agradeço imenso ter-me dado a palavra. Sim.
Conhece este assunto desde os seus primórdios. Então, antes de passarmos para o tema seguinte, eu vou convidar o embaixador Roland. 2 minutos. Quer reagir rapidamente ao que foi dito agora pelo Dr. Cadeado e pelo professor Yusuf Adam? Yes, Ambassador.
I don't want to interrupt the flow of the conversation, but I just would like to say that their elaborations of the general concept of dialogue and their more in-depth analysis of the situation on the ground is extremely important and shows us the way. And it reinforces my point that there is an enormous amount of expertise available in Mozambique, and a lot can be done with local, national resources. I think we are all sitting around the table to support, de apoiar Mozambique, but it shows that there is a lot of insight that should be used. And I'm very pleased that also what is shaping up is very much the need, the advice to all those who have to take decisions of an integrated approach where we have a strong economic, a strong political, and where needed a security element. But as I said earlier, and as many others have said, this broad approach, this inclusive approach is essential. And I think that came out of the last 2 interventions. Obrigado.
Thank you.
Muito obrigado, embaixador. Antes de irmos, Pierce, why don't you come in for 1 or 2 minutes?
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Adriano. Just a couple of comments. The bold question: Can you talk to terrorists, faceless terrorists? Well, you know, I think we need to perhaps debunk the myth that we're looking at some kind of unitary structure here, and that insurgents are not uniform by their very nature, and there are very different fault lines and possible access points. It's also important to understand how insurgents or aspects of insurgency are connected to community, and to explore the nature of those relationships and the potential for identifying different forms of influences within those relationships. So this is all part of this kind of research approach, intelligence-based approach, much of which I think has been done. And I want to reiterate, I think some of the work that has been done by our colleagues in Mozambique is really shining a light on the potential of what is possible. Now, within that context, often one will identify elements that you simply can't talk to. And so, you know, this is further down the line to look at strategies about how one engages with those kind of disruptive elements, those obstacles in the path. But often you will find within insurgencies that there are elements that will have a view to not staying in that particular situation. However, it's also important to remember that issues that drive individuals into an insurgency, their viewpoints, their motivations, and so forth may evolve and change, and that's why giving this attention now is so important, because the problems around radicalization, whether it's radicalization with religion or in terms of simply a criminal mindset on some of these issues, it then becomes harder and harder to address these issues. I just wanted to say two other things quickly. About the importance of having a strategy about what's going on. One of the repeated critiques we hear about the situation in Cabo Delgado is that there's not enough information, and I want to echo the words of Madame Michel. I think you spoke earlier this publicly and talked about the need for greater transparency in terms of the situation in Cabo Delgado, and I think that is an essential ingredient that is currently missing from the equation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pierre. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Pierre. In the interest of time, I will invite Richard Vance, my good colleague, Richard Vance. We had so many messages. Key is there is a need for a deep understanding of the root causes of this conflict. This is one. Two, they need...
He's speaking in English, Khalid. He's speaking in English.
Dialogue, which is to be inclusive. Some colleagues would ask, who are the interlocutors of that dialogue? And some would ask, is it possible to have a dialogue where there are no clear interlocutors? We have the government, you have local communities, you have the members of the state, so to say, but from the other side, you have we also had from the ministry, the defense ministry here, that this conflict, it can also be approached from non-militaristic means. And this is an important policy shift, as we have been seeing it evolving from the middle. The two of you, Richard Vance and Khalid from GSERF, you have to take us through that. Is it possible to organize a dialogue? Richard Vance.
Adriano, thank you very much indeed. I think you've just about given most of my presentation, which is fantastic. So you've teed me up nicely. I'm going to attempt to share my screen just so that I can put on a couple of slides to make my points a little bit clearer in both English and in Portuguese. Okay. You should be able to. So the first thing I'd like to cover. The situation within Cabo Delgado obviously calls for close examination of options to resolve dialogue. What does that really mean? And we've heard a lot of people talk about the balance between militaristic approaches and dialogue. And I think that that's really what it's the key aspect is where is the balance? How do you come up with a coherent process which makes sense in the context of Cabo Delgado? Obviously, one of the key issues is being able to improve security to Cabo Delgadans, improve security for the people and for investment opportunities to realize economic interests. But security can be realized not just through military means. It involves actually an awful lot more complex approaches. And anybody that's really addressed insurgency before, or counterinsurgency, as we like to call it, then you realize that actually the primacy is more towards dialogue and civilian rule of law aspects, etc. But the military, however, has a role to play, but it must be as part of an integrated and coherent process. And so we're going to look at some of the aspects of dialogue and how resolution dialogue plays into that type of coherent, holistic approach. So what is it? What is resolution dialogue? Well, the first thing I want to say is in response to Calton's question is can you with a organization? And I think that it's been answered really quite nicely, but I'll succinctly put it in a way that we are aware that that the perpetrators of violence are not necessarily acting independently. They are influenced by others who have interests in Cabo Delgado, whether that be in dominating certain territories for certain reasons, particularly from an illicit trade perspective, for example. We also are aware that there is financing that comes from internally. So in other words, that the perpetrators of violence are rewarded for some of the acts that they carry out, particularly when they're dominating specific areas of territory. And therefore, we are aware that there are people and groups that can influence the perpetrators of violence. And those are the individuals, those are some of the groupings of people that actually we'd focus dialogue on. And that's dialogue, therefore, is aimed at increasing understanding. We've made that point very, very clear. Mutual understanding of the problem is critical. That's the first step, addressing it. But also it's all about a lot of listening, and there's a lot of suspension of judgment needs to go on in dialogue. So people have to come prepared to a dialogue with a willingness to listen to what other people have to say and then form a common understanding. And that is really critical in this process, and come with a curious mindset. Now, resolution dialogue particularly focuses on one area, and that is really trying to establish common interests. And you'll hear me talk about interests quite a bit. And interest-based mediation or interest-based negotiation is all about getting to the root of stakeholder interests and trying to align those interests so that actually we can move forward in resolving interests. So rather than positions, talk about interests. Positions often cause an awful lot of deadlock in negotiations because people sit hard and fast on a certain position, when actually, if you can get to what their real true interests are, then you find it's a lot easier to start aligning them between different stakeholders. So resolution dialogue as a tool for peace. A lot of resolution dialogue has been attempted throughout Africa, and not all of it has been 100% successful. But when you've got to measure this as part of, as I said, a coherent process, and one that involves obviously security aspects. The one thing for sure is that dialogue in addressing problems for the longer term is far more effective than short-term military operations. And that is a critical point. And so whereas military operations have their role in a wider resolution process, actually it's dialogue in the longer term will have a longer term impact. I think one of the most interesting dialogues that's just taken place recently in Africa was the Sudanese Dialogue, interestingly enough facilitated by South Sudan, but involving at least 8 or 9 different stakeholders, a process that was about again, understanding what stakeholder interests were and trying to align those interests, given that there was a new dispensation within the government of Sudan and an opportunity to seize the moment and be able to find some resolution, particularly with all of the multiple armed groups that were still operating in Sudan. So drivers, we've talked about drivers and we've talked about the need for nuanced understanding. Two key drivers for an awful lot of what we're seeing, I think, within Cabo Delgado is greed, the need to dominate aspects of territory and have strong influence over how, if you like, economic interests are progressed. And secondly is grievances. And we see an awful lot of grievances in Cabo Delgado, particularly at a local level, between various different community groups. And between greed and grievances, they are usually the two key elements that drive conflict. And so therefore, satisfying these multiple interests, where we do have second economic interests, be they legal or illegal, but at the same time, we have socioeconomic grievances that need to be satisfied as well. And aligning those aspects up is really critical. And hence the need for a coherent, collaborative, inclusive process. And lastly, one that's voluntary. And there's no point in having dialogue unless you can get people to the table from a voluntary perspective. We'll say that ultimately dialogue can only be successful if you can build confidence and trust between the stakeholders. This is an underpinning element. And that doesn't begin straight away. And that's why dialogue can be a long process about building confidence, about building trust, about understanding each other's interests, about sharing issues, sharing dialogue, and coming together to be able to, as I said, to align interests and have a better appreciation of everybody's challenges. So trust is very important, and a mediation obviously has a key role in enabling that process in terms of building trust between different stakeholders. Another term that we use is mutually hurting stalemate, and it's questionable whether there is mutually hurting stalemate within Cabo Delgado. I'd suggest that there probably is, because nobody is winning out of this process at the minute, out of this conflict. Nobody is winning. There is no potential for, I think, for any particular stakeholder to be victorious. It will be just attritional. It will be kept within boundaries, as we've said, along certainly within 9 districts currently in Cabo Delgado, and everybody, regardless of whether you're a violent extremist or whether you're a private sector actor, is suffering at the minute. And perhaps the most important thing is that the local communities are suffering more than anybody else, and as a result of this violence. So mutually hurting stalemate, where all stakeholders are suffering to some degree, is the ideal opportunity to start a resolution dialogue. I'll very quickly run through what I say are 4 key stages of resolution dialogue. How does it work? First stage is critical, and that is establishing a safe environment, an environment where people are willing to talk, we're willing to share experiences, willing to have discussions openly. And often that environment has to be private. It's not a public setting, and people have to feel safe and confident that they can open up in that environment and that their interests will be looked after. And secondly, before dialogue really begins, there has to be a common basis. Everybody has to understand the purpose and structure of the process, and all stakeholders need to appreciate that. And often that takes place as part of a process of consultations prior to dialogue. And so in the Cabo Delgado context, it would be now that it is really critical, and particularly assessment, it's understanding who the key stakeholders are, how to bring in the relevant support regionally and maybe even internationally, but actually more importantly, who are the local stakeholders to engage with, consulting with them, and ensuring that there is a consensus among stakeholders to how this process might take place. Secondly, you've heard this many, many times from all the speakers today, which is great, and that is the idea of developing a common base of knowledge. When in a dialogue process, I've said this before, it's suspending judgment is really important. Being able to listen is a really important skill. And this is where we explore stakeholder beliefs, perceptions, and narratives. The whole idea is to try and synthesize all of these approaches and develop a common base of knowledge. This is where relationship building is key. And this is where the mediation should come in to really help facilitate building relationships as stakeholders share experiences and share their understanding of the situation. And ultimately, by building up this rapport, that a common understanding between stakeholders can be built. Not everybody's going to agree all the time, but it's having that common basis which to build on. The third phase is potentially, or third stage is potentially the most important, where actually once a common understanding is developed, once there is some trust amongst stakeholders and there is some confidence to share ideas, this is where the key conflict-related issues are discussed. And this is once again where getting into the detail of what stakeholder interests are. What are the interests of the key stakeholders? And as they're discussed, it's more likely that they will naturally align amongst a group of stakeholders that have built trust and confidence with each other. And again, the mediation has a key role in this at this point in time, because often this is where you find deadlock in discussions, and the mediation's role there is to table concepts and different ideas to prompt more discussion, to prompt more dialogue between the stakeholders, and again, to put ideas on the table that may be options that the stakeholders can see as may satisfy their interests going forward. And finally, the most important aspect is if you can have successful dialogue where there is a number of agreements, but it's actually perpetuating that communication between stakeholders so that joint decisions can be made. And actually, the communication then takes place naturally between stakeholders. It doesn't have to be facilitated. So naturally, dialogue takes place, interests are aligned, and individual stakeholders or groups of stakeholders actually begin to communicate with each other to resolve sort of key issues. And that's when you actually acknowledge that there's some success within the dialogue process. So I'm going to finish now with those 4 points. I will finish off by saying that you may have seen that CDD are releasing a series of briefings which look at different aspects of conflict resolution. If you're not on the mailing list, then I suggest you get on it, because there is resolving conflict in Cabo Delgado and resolution dialogue. The next one will come out next week, which will look at the role of amnesty and alternative livelihoods. And then we're also going to do a piece looking at preventing violent extremism and how to introduce that element into dialogue. So please look out for those. But thank you very much for the opportunity, Adriano, and I look forward to further discussion. Thank you.
Richard Renz, muito obrigado. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Richard, for that brilliant presentation. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Richard. So the dialogue is possible. Carlton Kadead, meu amigo, 1 minute.
You have just 1 minute. Professor, thank you very much. Once again, congratulations for having organized this debate. I like what Richard said, and the issues he mentioned reminded me a lot of issues we discussed within the classroom. Congratulations, Richard. But I still have a number of doubts in the negotiation experiences in these countries. It has always been made clear that there is a need to go to the center of those who really count when we are talking about negotiation. Usually, when we talk about negotiations, We need to reach the heart of those who count, who matter, who decide negotiation. Professor is important, but they do not have the decision-making power in order to influence in a negotiation. I will finish with an example that happened during the liberation war in Mozambique. Frelimo always said that we need to go to the heart of those who really decide in the Portuguese system in order to decide without using any intermediaries, but going straight to those at the heart of the problem. Otherwise, the exercise would have been a failure. We need to decide who shows the face of the leaders of this group. Without this, it's going to be a big waste of time. I'm not misunderstanding, minimizing the importance of the other stuff. Thank you. There's no sound. There's no sound. Adriano, there is no sound. Okay. At the community level, and those who deal with the masses. Yesterday, President Newsom said at the meeting on oil and gas that he will devolve peace to Cabo Delgado. And we thought that this event fits very well in this commitment of the President of the Republic in finding peace so that we can develop Mozambique in an inclusive way. Professor Yusuf Adam, half a minute before we give the floor to my friend Khalid.
Tomar café, professor Yusuf Adam, quando voltar. Passamos para a última apresentação do
to the last presentation of Professor Khalid. He is from the Global Resilient, our partner, our important partner and stakeholder in the initiatives on preventing and countering violent extremism. Very important, the work that you do. Thank you very much. You have the floor.
Thank you. Can you? Yes? Great. Thanks very much. Let me start by hosting, as you say, a very timely event. And thanks also to the co-chairs for their excellent moderation. It's an honor for me to be participating with this distinguished panel of experts. And can I also take the opportunity, I think we all should, wish you and your families good and bright futures during and after the global pandemic. Before reading out a short statement I prepared, I just wanted to note, I've scribbled down some notes on the excellent contributions we've heard so far. A very consensus. That's from speakers from a defense perspective, a deputy perspective, and a development perspective. I did, for example, talk of a context, but still one that learns lessons from elsewhere. There are lessons certainly to learn. I thought security responses alone being insufficient, and the importance of an integrated and inclusive approach. I think we've all heard about the importance of addressing root causes and in particular grievances. We've heard about the importance on the one hand of dealing with the short-term immediate crisis, but equally finding long-term solutions. We've heard about the importance of good governance and strong institutions, but equally the role that can be played by local leaders. And I think again and again, we've heard about the importance of coordination between efforts, whether national or national. I think those are all points and lessons take on this panel. To a large extent, what I'm going to speak about in the next 5 minutes, please reinforce those points. Global Community Engagement Fund, GCERF. GCERF is the only international organization with a global mandate on preventing violent extremism. Provide grants to local organizations in order to protect individuals, reintegrate fraternity, and build community resilience against radicalization and over the past 3 years, we've invested over $100 million in communities across the world, including many in sub-Saharan Africa. Our grants have reached 2 million people at direct risk and a further 10 million people in the communities around them. We provide better alternatives to violent extremism by investing in improving cohesion within communities, strengthening the relationship between government and communities, access to livelihoods and skills, and developing their personal sense of purpose and self-worth. Our multilateral governing board has equal representation for donor countries, partner countries, the private sector, and civil society. We are funded by security, development, and humanitarian donors. At the national level, country ownership is a guiding principle, and we work closely with national governments to promote their own security and development policy. We partner in countries with the United Nations and other international organizations. We try to convert political cooperation at the international level into practical results at the local level. In some countries, GCERF works directly in regions where violent extremism is already a critical threat. In others, we work in surrounding regions to help contain and stop the spread of violent extremism and its negative impacts. You kindly invited me today to say a few words, provide a brief introduction to preventing and countering violent extremism. I'm not an expert on Mozambique, and so I propose to provide insights from other contexts, and I look forward to learning from you how these may or may not be relevant for Mozambique. Let me say already that GCERF is currently discussing with the government of Mozambique opportunities to partner together. On preventing and countering extremism, there is still considerable debate about terminology, and I don't really want to get into that debate here. For the sake of simplicity, let me simply refer to preventing violent extremism, PVE. And I'd like to very briefly introduce PVE by explaining first what it is, secondly, what it is not, and thirdly, how to do it. So firstly, what is PVE, preventing violent extremism? I suggest it has three key characteristics. One, it focuses on drivers. These are the reasons why people may become radicalized or recruited to violent extremism in the first place. Our experience suggests that these reasons may include marginalization, frustration, resentment, and we've heard about grievances as well. Two, PVE focuses on people at risk, but also people who can influence them. For example, teachers, religious leaders, and community change agents. And three, PVE focuses on sustainable alternatives to violent extremism, such as education, employment, and empowerment. Secondly, what is PVE not? First, it is not an alternative to security responses to violent extremism. It is a complement. We know that security responses can have unintended consequences and can alienate people. PVE is a way to build a social contract with communities. Second, it does not elevate civil society above local and national authorities, nor does it undermine state authority. PVE is a way to build relationships between communities and authorities and to strengthen the credibility of institutions and the implementation of national policies. And thirdly, and I think importantly, it is not expensive. The return on investment for modest infants and people is far greater and far longer lasting than the return on investment on massive investment in security. Thirdly, how best to do PVE. One, effective PVE promotes national ownership. It is led by governments and is integral to the success of national strategies and policies to address violence and extremism. Two, effective PVE, as we've heard, is sensitive to the law text. There is no one-size-fits-all for a PVE approach, but there are common denominators, such as respecting gender and diversity. And 3, effective PVE involves local communities from the outset, from designing through delivering to assessing projects. Let me conclude by reiterating that GSERV looks forward to working with partners on this call and with the government of Mozambique, working in partnership to do the following: to provide better alternatives to people at risk, thus deplete violent extremist groups of new recruits; to turn the vicious cycle of violent extremism, where despair breeds the resentment upon which violent extremists prey, into a virtuous cycle, where communities are resilient and can prosper; to replace the negative consequences of violent extremism, including the drain on public resources, into positive outcomes, such as greater investment, including from the private sector; to reinforce a new approach to addressing violent extremism that combines security and development resources and builds meaningful partnership; and finally, to elevate ambition beyond the immediate crisis towards conceiving a future generation in Mozambique without extremism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khalid Kozar, for those remarks. It is not expensive to prevent violent extremism, and it pays. Peace, sustainability, and it enables to reach everyone, including the poor. Thank you very much, Dr. Khalid, for those comments. We have made the first round of interventions. I will go back to all of you with the very same order, giving 2.5 minutes to each of you to make final comments. What is number one? The president yesterday said he's committed to finding solution for peace for Cabo Delgado. He's committed for solutions for peace. This commitment was made at the private sector conference yesterday on oil and gas. This is important. Second, we have SADC. SADC is in town. Their technical deployment is in town. And they are listening to stakeholders. They want to understand the situation, how best can SADC help. We have the statements by Colonel Sarang, where he said 3 things. Number one, the need for the army to protect Mozambique's sovereignty and Mozambique's resources. Second, dialogue is important. Not only military approach can lead to the solution, but he said it is difficult to engage a faceless violent group. Some colleagues, including Kader, he has doubts whether a fruitful dialogue can be organized with faceless insurgents. Professor Yusuf Adam, he said, he seems not to be there. He said something. He's a historian, so he speaks in a way that sometimes you need to know him to understand. What he's saying is the following: that dialogue, it's also about understanding governance failures and addressing those problems in a constructive and inclusive way. And in so doing, strengthening the relationship and improving the relationship and trust between in the platform of governance in government and local communities, including IDPs. This is the message that I was conveying. And I think this is a key message. The need to understand this dialogue, these insurgents. One thing which is important here that was said by Ambassador Roland and also by Piers and Liesel is, well, one thing is to have oil or to have diamonds that you can quickly take and go to the markets. The other thing is to have gas. It's a longer term billion-dollar investment, which brings, which has next to it low-hanging fruits. And some of the low-hanging fruits can be captured by those who are in the position, and the privileged position. And if this is happening, it can create problems. So the mechanism, not only to say the revenues will be shared, but start from the low-hanging fruits, allowing marginalized groups, local communities, also to be part of sharing these low-hanging fruits. And that is the best policy signal that the future revenues will be shared. So I would like to go back to each and one of you and say final 3-minute comments. And Richard has taken us through the all possibilities of dialogue. And again, emphasizing what Professor Yusuf Adam had said, that it is possible to engage in a constructive dialogue. And that is urgent. It's urgent. And that must be an inclusive, participatory, inclusive dialogue, including the IDPs, So it's not only about the plate of food for IDPs, it's also about them participating in the governance of their situation. Let us talk to the IDPs, not only give them food. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. And I think, Prof, you have already drawn some of the conclusions, but I think a few remarks. In the first place, on the practical considerations, and secondly, on more, let me say, important theoretical considerations given by Richard and Khalid. Essential, and we haven't mentioned that because we assume it's there, of course, is the political will to address the conflicts, including the political will to address some of the interests, financial, political, and otherwise behind this, which will have, to give in at some points. So there will be interest will be affected, and that requires clear determination and leadership. And the fact that the president has said that he is committed to finding a solution for peace is a first step. In the Netherlands, we are at the moment in a huge political crisis because of lack of confidence in the government. So it is something that happens all over the world. Many of these problems, of course, are not specific to Mozambique, to Southern Africa, they are global. But political will is a first important thing. And Prof, you are engaging the cabinet, you are engaging the political system and the leadership. That's a very important practical thing. Secondly, SADC, yes. As I said in the previous meeting, I've been with SADC since 1980 when I was a member of the Lesotho delegation. Certainly politically important, certainly essential in the region. Whether Southbreak will be able to mobilize, I think, is a big and open question. So militarily, absolutely limitations, but certainly important to involve the neighboring states, notably, of course, Tanzania, certainly also Zimbabwe and South Africa. So SADC might contribute to an analysis, but it will also bring together the different countries. And then what the colonel said, yes, of course, the government has the obligation to protect. The question is how this is done, how this is done, how this is linked to dialogue and other issues. The second point that the colonel made, dialogue, again, I think it cannot be underestimated how important it is that both from the President's office and the Ministry of Defense, this call for dialogue is brought up. And then, of course, the big desafio enorme, the real challenge to dialogue with faceless violent groups, because that will have to be done. And I think, my time is over, but what Khalid and Richard pointed at is there are very systematic approaches. They will not lead automatically to success, but they can be used to organize the principle of a dialogue. And then finally, my question, of course, is it possible for a number of Mozambican NGOs to contribute to the organization of such a dialogue, to bring together the groups? I've seen myself in the Eastern Congo, and Richard has seen the same, how difficult it is to bring faceless violent groups around the table, but it has to be done, and ways and means have to be found. And I think there, the national Mozambican capacity, I repeat it, is extremely important at a practical level, backed up by solid theoretical and possibly diplomatic support from elsewhere. Let me stop here.
Ambassador, thank you very much for these remarks. I would now like to give the floor to our colleague and friend for your final comments.
Thank you, Chair, and I want to pick up quickly on what Ambassador Van der Geer was saying about political will. I think and this also relates to obviously the question that was asked by Carlton Kadaida, which I think is an important one in terms of understanding the power matrix in any situation. Clearly, processes such as these need political champions, and it is important to understand the political power matrix in any one situation and the importance of shifting the calculus of those key power actors and how best to do it. You know, I think one thing sometimes external NGOs don't understand is, with all the best will in the world, their advocacy work isn't necessarily a direct line. They have to talk to other constituencies, and those constituencies must be articulating those issues that the power structure will listen to. So I think one needs to think about strategy and tactics about building that political will. And I think also it's important with respect to dialogue processes to understand what the risk elements are, and also to put in place. And I'm sure Richard and Khalid have got a lot of experience and insights into this. How do you deal with spoilers? How do you deal with accountability in these processes? These are not easy, and there are no easy answers. I'm going to leave it there and say thank you very much for the opportunity.
Liesl.
Thank you very much, Adriano, and everybody for a very interesting debate. I think my last contribution would be force and multilateral interventions have not worked across the African continent. And that is, that is why we need to learn lessons from elsewhere. In the Sahel, since the invasion of Mali in 2012 and the United Nations, French troops against the jihadists in the Sahel against Boko Haram, against Al-Shabaab in Somalia, those military interventions have not worked, and in some cases the violence has increased. So we have no choice really to look at alternative solutions. So in 2018, when one of my colleagues, Dr. Alojo Akinola, wrote a piece saying, should we not consider dialoguing with Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab? And you'll find the policy brief on the IS website. There was outcry. Some people said, that is impossible. How can that be? We can't dialogue with people who were responsible for such atrocities. But the bottom line is we have to think of alternative solutions. And for then, and we have all the experts here, and it was really very interesting listening to you on PPE, and as you said, there's a lot of people with a lot of experience. But what we have learned from, I think, the ISS approaches and so on, is that there has to be access to civil society researchers from the country and from elsewhere to be able to, for example, we've done a lot on Boko Haram, for example, asking communities, do they agree with dialogue with the violent groups? But to do those studies, it takes a lot of time and many years, but we actually, instead of waiting 10 years like we've done in other parts of Africa, we can learn that experience and say, okay, there is an urgent security crisis, SADC is available. And the reason why I was so adamant about SADC is to say, in the Sahel, there was foreign military intervention. Now we're going back to the neighbors and say, okay, we're creating the G5 Sahel because local solutions. So we have to look at SADC because this is a regional problem. But any military intervention should first look at doing no harm, no human rights abuses, and looking at alternative solutions, because we have no choice, and we've seen it on the continent. So thank you so much for inviting me and the ISS, and I really hope a lot of success to all your efforts. Thank you.
I cannot hear Adriano. Okay. Stefan, you have 2 minutes for your final
Sure.
comments.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you again to Prof. Nwonga and CTD and the rest of the team, my co-panelists for today. Perhaps just as a final thought, just to add emphasis to, I think, the importance of keeping channels for dialogue open and creating channels is really of paramount importance. As I think we've seen in other contexts on the continent, that the longer an insurgency is grinds on, the more transnational it gets. This intergenerational consequences, and the deeper it becomes and harder it is to resolve. So I think perhaps at this stage in the conflict in Cabo Delgado, where there doesn't seem to be a single charismatic leader to Al-Sunnah, where perhaps they haven't consolidated large degree, there's some interesting opportunities for dialogue. But I think we need to consider the wider conflict system, and as Liesl and Piers also mentioned, by respecting human rights, by lowering the level of grievances, I think in the region just improves opportunity for dialogue to work in the long term. Because at the moment, the level of violence makes, I think, prospects for dialogue difficult. But yeah, I'll leave it there and just thank the rest of the panel.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Richard.
Thank you, Adriano. Yeah, absolutely. A couple of quick comments. I'd really support what Liesl just said, and that is the aspect of any type of security intervention, whether it be military nature or otherwise, must seek to do no harm. It cannot make the situation worse. And unfortunately, we have too many examples of that in the continent and elsewhere in the world, where incorrect or inappropriately applied military operations have actually served to escalate conflict. But I'll also mention one other thing, and that is back to stage 2 of the process of dialogue, and that's about developing this common base of knowledge. I've heard a lot today about people referring to an insurgency, and the fact that we've all become very much rooted in the fact that this is actually what we're seeing is an insurgency. And we all know that there are multiple definitions for insurgency, but one of the main definitions would lead you to believe that there is some actual political motive in this violence. And yet we really don't see any evidence of that. We've all become rooted in insurgency. So part of the process of developing a common base of knowledge is to kind of suspend some of that judgment and think about other hypotheses. Certain other hypotheses are on the table. Think of this in a different context, or more like we've maybe seen in Central South America, like the idea of competing cartels, where basically alliances of convenience are developed between violent extremists, between criminals, etc. And they're influenced by a number of masters, a number of financiers, and it becomes a very, very complex environment without one true political or in fact financial or social sort of motive. And then if you look at it in that context, then you can seek to see how the dialogue may have a lot of benefits on the basis of insurgency. So the point being is, suspend judgment, gather the knowledge, gather the information, look at the hypotheses, see where the weight of the hypothesis lays, and then seek dialogue around that. And perhaps let's not get rooted into some of these phrases like insurgency. Thank you.
Richard Renz, meu amigo.
Richard Renz, my friends, thank you very much for these remarks. I'm now going to invite Dr. Khalid for your final comments. Our partner from GCERT, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. And let me also thank the organizers and the other panelists. The challenge of going last on a panel that largely agrees with each other is that there's not much to add to what we've heard. But let me just say this, really as a way of summarizing what I think I've heard over the last hour or so. It does seem to me that the conclusion around this table is that this is the right time to act. We've heard that there is clear political will within the government in Mozambique. We've heard that there is a regional interest in getting this right for both security and development and political reasons. We've heard that there is an opportunity with a very strong civil society base within Mozambique. We know that there's a private sector stake in all of this, and that should be an opportunity if managed effectively. We've heard from around the table that we do have experience and lessons that we can learn and apply from elsewhere, both in Africa and globally. Let's make sure we mobilize those lessons to make sure we do this correctly and in an appropriate way. And I think finally, at last, we have, I think, clear acknowledgement around this table and more globally, traditional responses to violent extremism simply don't work. And I think there's an appetite for new, integrated, coordinated response. For all reasons, we'll look together with the government, with other partners, to intervene now to make a lasting difference. And I again welcome the opportunity to work with all of you to realize that ambition. Thank you.
Posso agora convidar o meu colega Anthony.
I would now like to invite my colleague Anthony Bonucci to make the final comments, and then we will close our session. Anthony.
Professor, thank you very much, and everyone who has joined us this evening for this very important conversation. The message is very clear, that dialogue is the response of the strong and of the wise. Society business do not thrive when we force quick, empty solutions can provide any societal stability. So I thank you for joining us today. And this is, I hope, a start of a deep conversation, Professor. And please stay tuned to what CED produces in the next weeks. Thank you.
Muito obrigado, Anton. Muito obrigado a todos. Como Anton diz, este é o...
Thank you very much to all. This is the beginning of the process that we are going to start with a focus on the is a webinar in order to initiate this process. Feel free to contact us on the basis of the context that we have here. We want to be inclusive in this process, in this dialogue. We want to involve everyone, and we will want to influence everyone, influence the narratives. We want to mobilize the stakeholders at national level, international, at the provincial, at the district level, so that we, in an inclusive way, can work in a dialogue that may allow the low-hanging fruits reach everyone, and the apparent competition of the elites can be in a context of building of state, the Mozambican nation. Once again, thank you very much to everyone, all the partners, Ambassador, IICG. Thank you very much for this partnership, Anton Bonich, Richard, to the whole team of the CDD, in particular to the television team. Thank you very much, and we are going to announce you the